you normally have time to prepare yourself to defend against the sermon that's coming. This morning, because I'm going to preach in all of the services, we are already sermonic. That's where we find ourselves, ready to have the message. And we pray that this is a time where God speaks to us. I was a young associate, had just gotten out of seminary, and I'd only done a couple funerals when I was called upon to have the great honor of presiding over not only a funeral, but then a graveside service at the National Cemetery on the north side of town. Now, it's a rolling, green, beautiful space there in an otherwise unattractive part of Houston, which is saying something, and I'm a native son, where folks that have served this country in a number of branches of service are laid to rest, and their families too. And this person we were having a service for was a Pearl Harbor veteran. Had joined the Navy in his late teens and was there and had served through the Pacific theater of that war and had lived many, many decades afterwards. And then his family turned to a 20-something-year-old preacher to try to make sense of life, death, the gospel, and his story. And no words that I said came close to the power of a moment that happened at the graveside service. Many of you here, especially in this town, probably have been to, maybe have been a part of, have seen a service with military honors attached to it, and this was one of those. The rifles, guns salute, the words said to the grieving family, the flag folded with honor and precision handed over to the family. Words spoken of thanks on behalf of grateful people. And then at the very end, the honor guard stood back, and there was one in the midst of the honor guard who was a seasoned veteran of life. And that's my term because I'm not allowed to talk about age ever, so he had many, many decades of experience breathing. I do not know what he was a veteran of, but looking at him, I thought maybe he was a veteran of the First World War. I mean, he was just a senior, and he physically was every movement was an effort. And no words that I said, at least, ever came close to the power of the moment when he stepped back and they stood as straight as they could. And I don't know if it was something in his shoulder or the weakness in his arm. He couldn't lift his hand. And so he brought his other hand to it. With two hands, he saluted his fallen comrade. And I thought, there's a tangible witness of how much legacy and our past matters, about respect for the sacrifice of others that we recognize in our own journey, perhaps. It was beautiful. I didn't tell him that because men don't say that to each other in conversation, but it was a beautiful moment where he, in fact, showed me what it looked like to give honor to someone because the past mattered. And friends, that image stood in stark relief. The gentleman we were burying was 18 when his service began. Let me just say, no one, including my parents, will be saluting with one hand or two what I was doing when I was 18. But this person had given and had offered themselves in such a way as to leave a legacy. It got me thinking about the legacies that we leave, the past that we build on, and the future we make possible by the way we live in this present moment, by our sacrifices, by the stories that we live and we tell. Nehemiah is an Old Testament book, and Nehemiah was born in exile. The people of God had rebelled against God. They had found foreign alliances. They had done all kinds of things. Warnings had come over and over again. This will lead to your destruction. This will lead to being driven out of the city. And in the 580, 86, 587, somewhere around there, BC, the temple is destroyed. Jerusalem falls. The desperation and the leaders are driven out into the east, into exile, until someone stronger defeats the Babylonians, and Nehemiah finds himself in service to a new king in the east. The book of Nehemiah begins with him hearing stories of those who had gone back to Jerusalem and seeing the place of his ancestors in disrepair, the gates burned and broken, the temple bowled over, and he wept, and he fasted, and he prayed. And in that prayer, he confessed the brokenness that had led to the exile, and then he sought out God's favor for restoration. Nehemiah was seized with this understanding that the way it was isn't how it was supposed to be. The way things were could be different. Nehemiah had hope. And the last line of chapter 1 is so strange. He prays this beautiful prayer, and in the last line says, I was a cupbearer for the king. It just seems odd that he put a little resume note in there. It's just like as if you wrote a prayer for your friend and say, I just want you to know I was promoted to be senior vice president at my company. Except what it was the desperation that had led to Nehemiah's prayer finding an opportunity. That's what happens when the people of God get desperate about what could be and what isn't yet. What should be, what ought to be, and yet is not yet in our neighborhoods. When that becomes prayer and it meets opportunity, God does some pretty amazing things. In chapter 2, we hear of all the inspections and things that Nehemiah is doing. And in chapter 3, a laundry list of names and people who have been assigned to the work of rebuilding on the foundation of Jerusalem. The folks around the area aren't too pleased that Jerusalem might be restored and the Jews might return in power. And that's where we find ourselves in chapter 4 with our passage for today where we listen for the word of God. Taunts like this had been coming. What are these feeble Jews doing? Will they restore things? Will they sacrifice? That is, will they rebuild the temple? Will they revive the stones out of the heaps of rubbish and burned ones at that? So Tobiah the Amorite and Sanballat, these are folks that are tribal chieftains of other groups that are opposed to this. And so when their complaints are heard by the Jews who have been working hard in the effort to rebuild the wall, it's half as high as it should be. We hear Israel, Judah say this: the strength of the burden bearers is failing, and there is too much rubbish, so that we are unable to work on the wall. The burden's the same. The rubbish has been there. It is the threat of the outside, and maybe the fears within, that minimize them and make them concerned that this project cannot be done. Recall, as we've spoken, that doubt is not the opposite of faith. Fear is. It is fear that eats away at our hearts and makes us small. It's fear that minimizes our capacity to respond to God's grace. It's fear that makes us less likely to use our talents, our time, our capacities that God has filled us with. The burden bearers, those who are carrying the burden, were failing. And there's just too much trash. We have felt this in our lives and in churches, that the burden is too much and the junk is too many. And our enemies said they will not know or see anything before we sneak up on them and kill them and stop the work. When the Jews who lived nearby came, they said to us 10 times, I want to be clear, from all the places where they live, they will come up against us. So in the lowest parts of the space behind the wall, in open spaces, remember the wall's not finished, I stationed the people, listen, according to their families, with swords, their spears, and their bows. After I looked these things over, I stood up and said to the nobles and the officials, the leaders, and the rest of the people, do not be afraid of them. Remember. Don't be afraid. Remember. The Lord your God is great and awesome, and fight. Fight for your kin, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your home. When the enemy heard that their plot was known to us and that God had frustrated it, we all returned to the wall. Notice the work can be done now. They've been rallied, and the plot has been foiled, each to their own work. From that day on, half of my servants worked on construction, and half held the spears, shields, bows, and body armor. And the leaders posted themselves behind the wall, behind the whole house of Judah. Here ends the reading, the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Nehemiah is aching in heart that what is and shouldn't be is fixed. The desperation drives him to prayer. The opportunity brings him to a king that he's a cupbearer for, and he is sent back with resources and capacity to rebuild the fallen city. He finds the gates in ruin, the walls in ruin, and collects people by their families. And in chapter 3, we get all of their names. We find out about the different people who worked. And chapter 3 of Nehemiah is one of those classic Bible passages that you skip the minute you realize you're in one. You know, when all the begatting happens, oh, let's turn the page on that. Or when all these names and families happen, and we think, well, what does that matter? Because they matter to Nehemiah. Because it's a story of a person who made relationship with people and then built a place that would be safe. And he says, remember, you think these folks that are set against you, that think we're feeble and can't get this done, remember that the enemy isn't nearly as awesome and strong as the one who has called us to this work. Our God is awesome and great. So remember that, and then fight. Fight for your kin, for your sons, for your daughters, for your spouses, and for your homes. Fight. It's been a great privilege over the last 4 months as I have come to get to know the people of University and the mission of this place. June 26th was my first Sunday, so we are coming up on my 4-month anniversary. And in these conversations that we've been having, these listening sessions, if you haven't been a chance to be at one, we have a dozen, 15 more to go. And there will be several that are just all calls that'll be in here and in the evening and during the day for those that can't make the other ones or are not able to make their groups. And I ask these questions about who we are and how we got here and where you think God's calling us. And I get to listen. And I love listening to you tell me where God's heart beats in this, your community. Great stories and legacy of the past about those brave and capable folks who came from Woodlawn and said there needs to be a church out there, so we're going to build it in a field full of cattle. I know it's hard to imagine that where you sit used to be bovine lunch line, but that's what it was. The development of San Antonio belies what it was like decades ago when these folks came out here on the edge, the frontier of town, and said, I am told, we want for the next generation for them to have what we had. A place where we belonged. A place that loved us when World War II was going on, a Sunday school, a place where we were married and where our families were buried, where baptisms and communion were shared, where the story of grace was told. We don't want a generation to be born that doesn't hear about it. We want to share it. That goes deep in the DNA of this place. That's why certain buildings were built first. It was a gym, not a sanctuary. That's why a bridge was built across the street for youth complexes and different styles of worship. That's why, apparently, you invite skaters into your building. I know churches, that people that love Jesus, that would be upset if they knew skateboarding was going on near their church. Well, every Sunday afternoon and Monday afternoon is happening in this church, where folks who wouldn't have a bridge built to worship in their lives wouldn't have it save for this people and this place, where they skateboard on a half pike and do things that I'm not cool enough to understand, and then hear a devotional about the hope that Jesus has for them. Many have been baptized, many have come to faith. This is a place and a people where folks say, you know, it's tough sometimes when you're raising a child with special needs or you're an adult with special needs to find a place that actually wants you to be there. And this church said, well, there's room in our house. And so every Sunday at 11 o'clock down in the McCreeless gym, 150 or some odd special needs people worship with amazing wonder and power the Lord of us all. Over and over again, I heard you tell me and continue to hear and want to know, is this who we are? That the heartbeat of what this church is about is something about making a place and being home. There's something, John 14, in my Father's house, there are many rooms going on here. Something about the call of God, that we would do all we could in our power to put stone on top of stone, walls on top of walls, gates that were wide open, that folks could come in and find God's grace, and if they don't come in, we'll go out of them till they hear it. And there's something in a home that's intergenerational, that goes from grandparents to parents to sons and daughters into the next generation. It doesn't matter whether biology is connected. That's a nice bonus if they look like us. But the truth of family at its bedrock, God has shown us this. He has chosen us in Jesus to be brothers and sisters. So there's something here at work and in words at our best where university is bringing together generations for the worship of our Lord and for the work that he has called us to. And that work takes lots of forms. But there is a fight. Nehemiah calls them all together and says, don't be afraid. There's plenty of reasons why church folk might be afraid today. The rising generation doesn't want to come to church. They don't want to sit in pews. They don't want to hear what you have to say. They're over it. Except, I met about 40 millennials. I'm not one. I know some of you look at me and think, well, surely that's your generation. Nope. I only look 13. I met with them and they talked about their commitment to this place and about finding home for them. They didn't all grow up in San Antonio, and so they came here with jobs and they had no relatives here, and they found family and a home here. Isn't that something? There's plenty of folks that are afraid that the darkness and despair, the cynicism that is tearing at the roots of who we are as a country, as a community, and as people will win. Who do they think they are? Still talking about grace and hope and love. It's old-fashioned and it won't work. We could be afraid of them, or we could remember. We can remember the legacy of those who have come before us that might bring us to salute the lives that they have lived and the sacrifices they have made. The words that we say matter, but the tangible, physical witness of that salute has stayed with me when words have faded. We too will lead with our deeds in the blessing of our neighbors. The words will follow. We will tell the story of what God has done in our lives and why we're on the move in this place. We will celebrate the legacy of those who have come before. The foundations of Jerusalem remain unchanged. It was the new walls that Nehemiah built. And he built it with pieces of the past. He piled it up. And he told them, stand a post and watch. See to it that those who enter our gates looking for safety and hope and healing find it here. So every day, including Sundays, we open wide the gates of this place. They wander in, and some of them sit in your pews. Every once in a while, they sit in your assigned seat. Will you take up the weapon of hospitality and greet them in love so that they know there's a place in this family for them to be healed and made whole, no matter what their story is, no matter how their family story is constructed? They come beat up and wounded from a battle not far from here. We know it well because there is a fight of despair and cynicism eating away at a rising generation that tells them the only thing that matters is what you can taste, touch, see, and get. The cynicism that means if we don't agree on everything, then we are enemies and we cannot be partners in a country or a cause. Can this be a place? Can we be builders of a structure and a foundation that brings people in and also sends people out? That builds bridges in between folks who vote for different folks, who believe different things, who come from different places, and yet find their family in Jesus in this place. And you think, that sounds impossible. Ask a Cubs fan today, what's possible? The exile and return, by the way, is about the same amount of years between last World Series and this one for the Cubs. That's how long it has taken. And yet Nehemiah is filled with a holy desperation. And so what I want to invite you to do is to cultivate with me in this place a prayerful heart of desperation. What is it that you see in our neighborhood, in our schools, in our families, on our streets, in our city, in our country, that like Nehemiah might drive us to prayer and fasting to say, it can't stay like this, Lord. It can't be the way it will be 10 years from now. Not if we do what God's calling us to do. Will women and children not be safer? Will they not have homes and places to be, and abuse and abusers separated from them? Will we not stand on that wall? Will we not stand on the wall that says to children, you don't really have a chance because you grew up in the wrong zip code? Will we stand on that wall? We stand on the wall and say to those folks, we are here to fight against those who say, if you don't fit the norm of a family system, if you're not married by 25 and have 2.2 kids, then you don't fit in our church. Well, we stand on the wall that says, God has made all kinds of families. God has made all kinds of people. And they have a place to worship, to work, and to belong here. As the generations gather, as the stories are told, can we be that people that in prayer and in opportunity find those spaces where we can bring healing and restoration and redemption through God's grace? Not only to our own hearts, to our houses, and to the neighborhoods that we have been sent to. It's a fight worth getting up for. It's a fight worth giving our time and our talents and our resources for. It's a fight that makes the future dreams of a generation yet to be possible. For there are yet unborn those who would come and live in the shade of the edifice that we construct together, that will come and make family happen in this space, because we will want for the next generation what we got from God in this space and all the spaces he has sent us to. After World War II, despair gripped at the heart of much of European thought. Captured in the writing of a novel in many places, but one in particular, a French author named Camus. And he wrote a book called The Plague. And The Plague is centered in a North African town. It's set in the past where when a plague happened and it got bad enough, they would quarantine the town and close the city to keep the plague from spreading. That's what happens. And the story explores human struggle with suffering, death, and dying, of hope and prayer and what it might mean, and the despair of those who understand and yet are leaning together against the plague's onset. And then at some point late in the novel, the numbers start to get better. Less people are sick. Less deaths are happening. The tide seems to have turned. And yet people still tried to escape the town, even realizing that they should have realized that the plague was about to end. They still were desperate. They still walked around looking at the ground in gloom. Camus writes that they had been so soaked in despair, they became immune to hope in all its forms. They were allergic to hope and were living behind the times, he writes. Do you know folks that are allergic to hope? I do. This is our fight. This is our dirt. This is our moment that we might live into the future that God has dreamed in this place. If we would keep up with the hope that he's pouring through us, on us, and around us. This is our call. This is our cause. That we would be people who drive hope into the world to those who fear that it's allergic. They cannot smell it, they cannot see it, they cannot hear it, so we keep putting it before them. We need to be the spiritual antihistamine, my friends, that the world could breathe deeply of God's grace. For we are not behind the times. Because of what Jesus has achieved on Easter morning by God's power in showing us that death is defeated, that the earth will be restored, that the victory is God's. We have a fight, but it's already won. We're ahead of the times. We've already read the victory of Jesus into our present moment. It's the future of God that brings forgiveness to this present moment, that brings healing and hope, capacity and power, and makes family of strangers and friends. It is in this place, within these beautiful bricks, that a place can happen for all who hunger and thirst for a hope they dared not believe could be. And that you and I are called to this work together, shoulder to shoulder, building an edifice of hope, an embassy of heaven here on earth. I'm excited about what God has willed and planned and has poured into this place, the capacities of what could be, what already is, and where our aching heart of our desperate prayer meets the opportunity that God has given us in these years.